I knew I probably shouldn't have been there. My sister Olivia's wedding was being held in the grand ballroom of the Harbor Grand Hotel in Savannah. The kind of place where the chandeliers looked like frozen waterfalls, and every surface reflected soft, golden light. The guest list included investors, surgeons, politicians, and the board members of Carter Biotech, the company my grandmother had spent her entire life building. People like that didn't usually look twice at someone like me. Still, I had barely stepped 10 feet inside the ballroom when my father spotted me. Thomas Carter didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull me aside. He didn't even pretend to smile for the sake of the guests gathered around him. Instead, he turned toward me in front of everyone and said something that made the entire room go still. "This wedding is for important people." His eyes moved slowly from my shoes to my face. "Not you." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned closer, the way people do when they sense family drama unfolding in real time. I could feel every pair of eyes in the ballroom sliding toward me. So I did the one thing I had been doing my entire life when it came to my family. I turned around and started walking toward the exit. But before I reached the doors, someone grabbed my hand.
"Wait,"
the groom said loudly. Marcus Hale's voice cut clean through the silence. "Don't let her go." The entire ballroom froze. Then he looked around the room and added calmly, "It's time everyone here knows who she really is." The Harbor Grand Ballroom looked exactly like the kind of place my sister had always dreamed of getting married in. White roses covered the ceremony arch at the far end of the room. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved through the crowd with silver trays filled with champagne flutes. Everything about the night screamed elegance and money. And somehow, standing there near the entrance in a simple navy dress, I felt like I had accidentally wandered into someone else's life. Most of the guests were people connected to Carter Biotech. I recognized several of them immediately. There was Harold Brenner from the company's board, standing near the bar with 2 hospital administrators. Across the room I spotted Melissa Grant, the investment strategist who had advised my father for years. Even a few local politicians were mingling near the stage. It made sense. Carter Biotech had grown into one of the most respected medical research companies in the region. My grandmother had started it decades ago with nothing but a tiny lab and a stubborn belief that medical breakthroughs shouldn't belong only to the richest corporations. The company had become the center of our family's world. At least, it had for everyone except me. I stood quietly near the edge of the ballroom, watching the guests greet Olivia. My sister looked perfect. Of course. Her wedding dress shimmered under the chandelier lights as people surrounded her with compliments and congratulations. My father stood proudly beside her, introducing her to executives and investors as if she were already the future leader of Carter Biotech. I had heard him say it many times before. "Olivia has the instincts for this business." People nodded politely each time he said it. No one ever asked what instincts I had. A few relatives noticed me standing there. Some recognized me immediately. I could tell by the quick expressions of surprise that flashed across their faces. But none of them came over to say hello. Most of them just looked away again. That part didn't surprise me. In our family, Olivia had always been the one who mattered. She studied business in college. She attended company meetings with my father. She knew the language of investments and research grants and expansion plans. I, on the other hand, worked in the archival department at Savannah State University, cataloging old medical research records and historical documents. My father liked to call it a very expensive hobby. I told myself I didn't care what he thought. But standing there in that ballroom, surrounded by the world he respected, I felt the familiar weight of being the extra person in a room that didn't expect me. I had almost decided not to come tonight. For days, I stared at the wedding invitation sitting on my kitchen table. The envelope had been addressed simply to Natalie Carter. No personal note. No message from Olivia. Just the invitation. In the end, I came because some stubborn part of me hoped that maybe things would be different this time. Maybe a wedding would remind my family that I was still part of it. I was wrong. My father had noticed me almost immediately. I saw the moment his eyes locked onto mine across the ballroom. His expression hardened in the way I knew too well. He walked straight toward me. his shoes clicking sharply against the polished floor. People near us began to fall silent as he approached. "Why are you here?" he asked. The question wasn't quiet. It wasn't angry either. It was worse than that. It was dismissive. "I thought family was invited," I said carefully. My father let out a short laugh. "This isn't a family picnic, Natalie," he replied. He gestured around the room. "This wedding is for important people." His voice grew louder. "Not you." A ripple of awkward silence spread through the nearby guests. I felt heat rise to my face, but I forced myself to stay calm. There was no point arguing. There never had been. So I nodded once, turned around, and started walking toward the exit doors at the far end of the ballroom. I was halfway across the room when I heard footsteps behind me. Then someone grabbed my wrist. "Natalie?" "Wait." I turned around in surprise. Marcus Hale, the groom, stood beside me, still holding my hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. The string quartet had stopped playing. Every single guest in the ballroom was staring at us. Marcus looked across the room toward my father, then toward the Carter Biotech board members seated near the front tables. Then he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't let her go." The room went completely silent. Marcus took a breath and said calmly, "It's time everyone here knows who she really is." The ballroom didn't breathe for several seconds after Marcus spoke. A moment earlier, the room had been buzzing with quiet conversations and the gentle music of the quartet. Now there was nothing but silence and the faint hum of the hotel's air conditioning. Marcus was still holding my hand. I wasn't even sure he realized it. Across the room, my father stood perfectly still, staring at us as if the entire scene had slipped out of his control in a way he couldn't quite process. "What are you doing?" he said finally. His voice wasn't loud this time. It was tight. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the back of the ballroom, where a man in a dark suit stood near one of the marble columns. I recognized him instantly. Gregory Whitman, the Carter family attorney. My stomach tightened. Something about the way he stood there, calm, watchful, made the entire moment feel less like an awkward interruption and more like the beginning of something planned. "This is not the time for a scene," my father said sharply. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Natalie was already leaving. His eyes moved toward Marcus, cold and impatient. "Let her go." Marcus didn't move. A few guests shifted in their chairs. Others leaned closer, curiosity beginning to outweigh politeness. "Actually," Marcus said calmly, "I think this is exactly the right time." The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. My father's jaw tightened. "This is a private family matter," he replied. "Then it's a good thing there's a lawyer here," Marcus said. That was when Gregory Whitman began walking toward us. I felt a strange chill run through me as he approached. The last time I had spoken to him was months earlier, just after my grandmother Eleanor Carter's funeral. He had handed me an envelope that day. I remembered the moment clearly because he had looked unusually serious when he gave it to me. "This was left for you," he said back then. I thanked him and slipped it into my bag without opening it. Life had felt too heavy that week to deal with paperwork. Later, the envelope ended up on my kitchen table, still sealed, still unopened, and apparently still important enough to bring a lawyer to my sister's wedding. Whitman stopped a few feet away from us. "Mr. Carter," he said calmly to my father, "I believe this conversation may concern matters that involve the Carter Trust." My father's eyes flashed. "You have no business discussing trust matters here," he said. Whitman didn't react. "Under ordinary circumstances, I would agree." His gaze moved briefly toward Marcus. "But certain circumstances have changed." I felt the entire room shift around us. People who had been pretending not to listen were now openly watching. A group of Carter Biotech board members had turned their chairs toward us. My father seemed to notice this too. His voice dropped another level. "This is a wedding," he said. Whitman nodded politely. "Yes." Then he added quietly, "But it also appears to be the first time all the relevant parties are in the same room." I felt Marcus's grip on my hand loosen slightly. He looked at me now. "Natalie," he said gently, His voice was softer than before, but it carried through the silent ballroom. "Did you ever read the letter your grandmother left you?" For a second I thought I had misheard him. "The letter," I repeated. He nodded. "The one Mr. Whitman delivered after Eleanor Carter's funeral." The entire room seemed to be waiting for my answer. I suddenly felt very aware of the envelope sitting in my apartment kitchen drawer. Still sealed. Still forgotten. "No," I said slowly. "I never opened it." A strange look passed between Marcus and the attorney. Not disappointment. More like confirmation. My father exhaled sharply. "Of course she didn't," he muttered. "This is ridiculous." But something in Whitman's expression told me the conversation was far from over. He opened his leather briefcase slowly and removed a sealed envelope. It looked identical to the one sitting in my kitchen drawer. "This," he said carefully, "is the duplicate copy of the document Eleanor Carter left for Natalie." A murmur spread through the ballroom. Olivia finally stepped forward. Her white wedding dress shimmered as she approached us. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and irritation. "What is going on?" she asked. Her eyes moved between Marcus, the lawyer, and me. "This is my wedding." Marcus looked at her with an apologetic smile. "I know. Then maybe this conversation can wait until tomorrow," she said. Whitman cleared his throat. "I'm afraid it cannot." My father turned toward him sharply. "You will not discuss my mother's will in the middle of a reception." Whitman's voice remained calm. "This is not about the will in the traditional sense." The board members were now standing. I saw Harold Brenner lean closer to another executive, whispering something under his breath. The room no longer looked like a wedding. It looked like the beginning of a board meeting. Whitman looked at me again. "Natalie," he said, "your grandmother created several legal protections when she structured the Carter Trust." I frowned. I thought Olivia inherited everything. That is what most people believe. Whitman said, "But Eleanor Carter had a habit of planning for possibilities others didn't consider." My father let out a harsh laugh. "Don't be dramatic." "Gregory," but the lawyer didn't even glance at him. He was still looking at me. "One of those protections," he said slowly, "involves you." The words made the air feel suddenly heavier. Olivia blinked. "Her," she said. My father's voice was sharp. "Natalie has nothing to do with Carter Biotech." Whitman folded his hands calmly over the envelope. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what we need to talk about." The lawyer didn't raise his voice, but somehow the entire ballroom heard him. "That," Gregory Whitman repeated calmly, "is exactly what we need to talk about." The words hung in the air like a sudden change in weather. A few guests near the back of the room leaned closer together, whispering. The string quartet had quietly stepped away from their instruments, unsure whether the ceremony would even continue. I stood there beside Marcus, still trying to understand why my name had suddenly become the center of attention. My father let out a short, sharp laugh. "This is absurd," Thomas Carter said. He turned toward the guests with a practiced smile that looked painfully forced. "My mother was known for dramatic gestures," he continued. "But there's no reason to turn my daughter's wedding into a legal spectacle." Whitman didn't react. Instead, he slowly placed the sealed envelope on the nearby table. "With respect, Thomas," he said, "this isn't a spectacle. It's a matter of the Carter Trust." The board members standing near the front shifted slightly. I noticed Harold Brenner, the chairman of the Carter Biotech Board, watching the envelope with a seriousness that made my chest tighten. "This document," Whitman continued, "was written by Eleanor Carter during the final year of her life." My father stepped closer. "You will not open that here." Whitman met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not opening it," he replied, "because Natalie already received her own copy." Every eye in the room turned toward me again. I suddenly wished I could disappear. "I told you," I said quietly. "I never opened it." Marcus glanced at me. "You probably should have." I gave him a look that said this wasn't helping. Whitman nodded thoughtfully. "That's understandable," he said. "The document is unusual." My father rubbed his temples. "This conversation is finished." he snapped. Gregory, you'll contact my office tomorrow. But before he could say anything else, Harold Brenner stepped forward. Actually, he said carefully, I'd like to hear what this is about. The room fell silent again. My father looked at him sharply. Harold, this is a private matter. Carter Trust matters are rarely private, Brenner replied. His eyes moved toward Whitman. Does this involve the contingency clause? The phrase seemed to ripple through the executive standing nearby. Whitman gave a small nod. Yes. A murmur spread through the group of board members. I looked between them, confused. The what clause? I asked. Whitman turned toward me. Your grandmother created a legal safeguard within her will, he explained. It's commonly referred to as the contingency clause. My father scoffed. A meaningless precaution, he said. Whitman ignored him. The clause was designed to protect Carter Biotech in the event that leadership decisions threatened the company's founding mission. My stomach tightened slightly. My grandmother thought someone in the family would threaten the company. Whitman didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, Eleanor Carter was a very careful planner. The room felt colder now. Brenner crossed his arms. What exactly does the clause do? Whitman spoke slowly. If certain conditions occur, the Carter Trust has the authority to temporarily intervene in company leadership decisions. My father laughed again. You're describing a theoretical safeguard. Whitman's gaze remained steady. The safeguard includes a designated trustee. The word trustee seemed to echo through the room. Who? Brenner asked. Whitman turned toward me. Natalie Carter. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Olivia laughed. A quick, disbelieving sound. You can't be serious, she said. My father's voice cut through the silence. This is ridiculous. Natalie has never been involved in Carter Biotech. Whitman folded his hands calmly. That was Eleanor Carter's decision. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. My grandmother named me as some kind of trustee. Yes. The word sounded strange when he said it, like it belonged to someone else. But why? I asked. Whitman studied me carefully. I believe Eleanor trusted your judgment. My father shook his head. My mother trusted experience. Whitman's eyes flickered briefly toward him. She trusted integrity. The tension in the room thickened. Marcus stepped forward slightly. Gregory, he said, maybe you should explain why this clause matters tonight. Whitman nodded. The contingency clause cannot activate without two elements. He held up two fingers. First, evidence that company leadership has violated the conditions Eleanor Carter set. And second, he continued, lowering his hand, the presence of the designated trustee. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Brenner spoke again. Are you suggesting those conditions might exist? Whitman looked toward Marcus. That may depend on what Mr. Hale discovered. Every head turned toward the groom. Marcus cleared his throat. My investment firm recently began negotiating a strategic partnership with Carter Biotech, he explained. As part of that process, our team conducted due diligence on the company's financial activity. My father's expression darkened. This is completely inappropriate. Marcus didn't look at him. During that review, he continued calmly, we discovered a transaction proposal involving Carter Biotech's oncology division. A few executives stiffened. My father's voice was tight. There are many proposals. Marcus nodded. Yes. He paused for a moment. But this one involves transferring control of several research patents to an outside pharmaceutical corporation. The board members started murmuring again. Brenner looked at Whitman. If that's true, Whitman finished the sentence quietly. It could qualify as a violation under Eleanor Carter's clause. My pulse started to race. Marcus looked at me then. This, he said gently, is why you needed to be here tonight. The room felt different after Marcus said that. Only a few minutes earlier, the ballroom had been filled with laughter, music, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Now the air was thick with tension, as if everyone suddenly realized they were witnessing something much bigger than a wedding interruption. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Some curious, some skeptical, some calculating. Marcus stepped slightly forward, addressing the board members who had gathered near the front. My firm began reviewing Carter Biotech's records when we started discussing a partnership, he said. Standard due diligence. Harold Brenner nodded slowly. That's normal, he said. Marcus continued. But during that review, our legal team found something unusual. Across the room, my father shifted his weight. What you found, Thomas Carter said sharply, were preliminary negotiations. Marcus didn't respond right away. Instead, he gestured toward the advisor standing near the entrance. A man in a gray suit stepped forward carrying a thin folder. The sight of it made the board members lean closer. This concerns a proposed licensing agreement, Marcus explained, between Carter Biotech and a multinational pharmaceutical group called Geneva Therapeutics. Several executives exchanged glances. My father's voice cut through the room. Licensing discussions happen all the time. Yes, Marcus said calmly. They do. He paused before continuing. But the oncology division isn't usually part of those discussions. The silence that followed felt heavy. I had grown up hearing about that division. My grandmother Eleanor Carter used to call it the heart of the company. The research teams there had spent years developing experimental cancer treatments. Treatments my grandmother had always insisted should remain under Carter Biotech's control. Brenner looked at Marcus carefully. You're saying those patents were included in the proposal? Marcus nodded once. Yes. My father laughed sharply. You're misinterpreting internal documents. But the advisor beside Marcus had already opened the folder. He removed several printed pages and handed them to Brenner. The chairman's expression changed as he read. This agreement transfers exclusive licensing rights, Brenner said slowly, to Geneva Therapeutics. A murmur spread across the group of executives. My father stepped forward. The agreement is still in negotiation. Not according to this timeline, Marcus replied. Another board member leaned over Brenner's shoulder. What timeline? Brenner tapped the document. It says the contract draft was scheduled for final review within 3 weeks. My father's jaw tightened. That's standard procedure. Marcus folded his hands calmly. The unusual part, he said, is that the board was never informed. Several heads turned toward Thomas Carter. This negotiation was conducted through executive channels only, Marcus continued, and the licensing agreement would transfer development authority over the oncology patents. The words seemed to ripple through the room. Development authority. That meant whoever controlled the patents would control the future research. Brenner looked up slowly. Eleanor Carter never allowed outside control of those patents. No, Marcus said quietly. She didn't. My chest tightened. For a moment I wasn't standing in a ballroom anymore. I was remembering something from years earlier. My grandmother's study had always smelled faintly of old books and cedarwood. Sunlight came through the tall windows that afternoon as she sat behind her desk, looking more tired than usual. I had been visiting her after work. She was staring at a folder filled with company reports. People misunderstand companies, she told me suddenly. I remember laughing softly. I barely understand them at all. She smiled faintly. That's not what I mean. Her fingers tapped the folder. Companies don't collapse because of enemies. She looked directly at me. They collapse because of the people who inherit them. At the time, I didn't know what she meant. I thought she was talking about some corporate rivalry I didn't understand. Now, standing in the middle of Olivia's wedding reception, I wondered if she had been warning me. The memory faded as Brenner spoke again. Thomas, he said carefully. Why wasn't the board informed about this negotiation? My father's voice hardened. Because it wasn't finalized? Whitman, the lawyer, stepped forward. Under Eleanor Carter's will, he said. Negotiations involving core research patents must be disclosed before contract drafting begins. The advisor lifted another page from the folder. This email suggests otherwise? He handed the paper to Brenner. The chairman read it silently. Then he inhaled slowly. What does it say? Another executive asked. Brenner looked up. It says the board will be informed after the preliminary agreement is signed. The murmurs grew louder. My father's voice cut in sharply. That email was taken out of context. But Marcus spoke again. There's another line, he said. Brenner glanced back down at the page. His expression darkened. It references the Carter Trust protections. Whitman leaned slightly forward. And Brenner read the line aloud. The trust clause won't be an obstacle. The words echoed through the room. For a moment no one spoke. Then Brenner looked up slowly. If this negotiation bypassed the trust safeguards. Whitman finished the thought quietly. Then the contingency clause may apply. My father's face had gone pale with anger. You're turning speculation into accusations. Marcus didn't raise his voice. I'm presenting evidence. He gestured toward the folder. And there's more. The advisor stepped forward again, carrying additional documents. Emails. Draft agreements. Financial projections. My pulse quickened as I realized what was happening. The wedding guests had stopped pretending to socialize. They were watching, listening, waiting. Because this wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a corporate confrontation. Marcus turned toward me briefly. This, he said quietly, is the kind of decision your grandmother was trying to prevent. Across the room, my father stared at the documents now being passed between board members. And for the first time all night, he didn't look confident. The folder Marcus's advisor brought forward seemed strangely small for something that could shake an entire company. But the moment the first document was passed into Harold Brenner's hands, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted again. The guests had stopped pretending this was still a wedding. People were standing now, leaning closer, whispering quietly as the Carter Biotech board members formed a tight circle near one of the reception tables. The flowers, the wedding arch, the music stands, all of it suddenly felt like scenery for the wrong event. Marcus stood calmly beside me while the executives studied the papers. What exactly are we looking at? One of the board members asked. The advisor answered first. Internal communications between Thomas Carter and representatives from Geneva Therapeutics. My father scoffed. You're reviewing private negotiations. But Brenner had already started reading. His eyes moved slowly across the page. This isn't just a discussion, he said. It's a draft agreement. Another board member stepped closer. For the oncology division, she asked. Brenner nodded once. Yes. The word spread through the group like a ripple. My father straightened his jacket. You're overreacting. Marcus spoke quietly. The agreement grants Geneva exclusive licensing rights to Carter Biotech's oncology patents. The woman beside Brenner frowned. That division produces half our research breakthroughs. And most of our future pipeline. Another executive added. My father spread his hands as if explaining something obvious. That's why the deal is valuable. I watched the board members carefully. Some of them looked confused. Others looked deeply uncomfortable. Marcus continued. The agreement doesn't just license existing patents. He paused. It also transfers authority over future development in that research field. The silence that followed felt heavy. Brenner slowly lowered the document. That would give Geneva control over the direction of our oncology research. Marcus nodded. Yes. One of the executives shook his head. That essentially turns Carter Biotech into a subcontractor. My father's voice grew sharper. It turns the company into a profitable partner. Marcus looked directly at him. It turns the company into something Eleanor Carter never intended. Whitman, the lawyer, stepped forward again. Eleanor Carter specifically restricted the sale of core research assets, he said calmly. The oncology division was the most protected part of the company. My father folded his arms. That restriction applied to completed sales. Whitman's expression didn't change. The clause also applies to negotiations that bypass board approval. Brenner looked up again. These emails indicate the board wasn't meant to see the agreement until after the preliminary contract was signed. My father didn't deny it this time. Because the board overreacts to everything, he replied. The tension around the table thickened. Another board member leaned toward Brenner. There's a timeline attached to the proposal, she said quietly. 3 weeks. Marcus nodded. That was the projected closing window. The murmurs grew louder. 3 weeks. The deal had been much closer to completion than anyone outside the negotiation realized. I felt a strange knot forming in my stomach. All my life I had been told that Olivia and my father understood the business world in ways I never would. But now it sounded like the most important decision in the company had been hidden from the very people responsible for overseeing it. Whitman spoke again. This is exactly the scenario Eleanor Carter anticipated. My father turned toward him sharply. My mother trusted me to run the company. Whitman didn't argue. She trusted you to lead responsibly. Marcus's advisor pulled another sheet from the folder. This is the email, mister. Brenner mentioned earlier. Brenner took it and read silently. Then he exhaled slowly. What does it say? One of the executives asked. Brenner looked up. It confirms the board will be informed after the preliminary agreement is finalized. He hesitated. And there's another line. He read it aloud. The Carter Trust Clause won't interfere. The words landed like a stone in still water. I watched the board members exchange glances. Some looked angry. Others looked stunned. Whitman spoke quietly. That clause exists to prevent this exact type of transfer. My father's patience finally broke. This is speculation. Marcus remained calm. It's documentation. Another board member stepped closer to Brenner. If this qualifies as an attempt to bypass the trust protections. Whitman nodded. Then the contingency clause could be triggered. The phrase seemed to freeze the air again. My father looked directly at me. For the first time since this conversation began. His expression wasn't dismissive. It was warning. You have no idea what you're stepping into, he said quietly. The words weren't shouted, but they carried more weight than anything he'd said all night. If that clause activates, he continued, you'll tear this company apart. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me again. Just an hour earlier, I had been the daughter being told she didn't belong at the wedding. Now the possibility hung in the air that I might hold the authority to challenge the most powerful person in the Carter family. I didn't know exactly how the clause worked, but I could feel the shift in the room. The board members weren't looking at my father anymore. They were looking at the documents. And occasionally, at me. Brenner straightened slowly. We need to review this properly. He glanced around the group of executives. If these communications represent a breach of the trust protections, he paused before finishing the sentence. Then the board will have no choice. My father's voice was low and furious. No choice about what? Brenner met his gaze evenly. We'll have to consider activating the contingency clause. The words echoed through the ballroom. Somewhere behind us. A champagne glass shattered quietly against the floor. No one turned to look. Because every person in the room was now watching the same thing, waiting to see what would happen next. The word vote seemed to settle over the ballroom like a storm cloud. For several seconds, no one moved. The wedding guests stood scattered around the room, holding half-finished drinks and whispering to one another. The musicians had quietly stepped away from the stage. Even the hotel staff had stopped pretending to continue service. Everyone was watching the same thing now. The Carter Biotech Board. Harold Brenner placed the documents carefully back on the table and looked around at the other executives. We need a few minutes, he said. The board members moved slightly away from the rest of the room, forming a tight circle near one of the marble columns. They spoke in low voices. From where I stood beside Marcus, I couldn't hear the details, but I could see their expressions. Concern, anger, calculation. Across the ballroom, my father paced slowly. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set. He wasn't looking at the board anymore. He was looking at me. Marcus leaned closer. You okay? He asked quietly. I exhaled slowly. I came here expecting to leave in 10 minutes, I said. He gave a small smile. Things changed. I watched the board members continue their discussion. They always do, I murmured. A few moments later, my father walked toward us. His expression had shifted again. The anger was still there, but now it was controlled, measured. Natalie, he said. I turned to face him. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. His voice was calm enough that most of the guests nearby couldn't hear him. This company is bigger than a clause in a legal document. I know, I said. That's why your mother built protections into it, he replied. Protections for the company, I said quietly. Not against it. His eyes hardened. You're letting outsiders manipulate you. Marcus didn't respond to that. But I did. I didn't ask for this, I said. Then step away from it. His voice lowered further. Let the board handle their own mistakes. I looked past him at the group of executives still studying the documents. They are handling it, I said. My father shook his head. You think this is about ethics? He said. It's about power. Maybe, I replied. But it's also about honesty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger. Something closer to uncertainty. Before he could say anything else, Brenner called out, Thomas. The board chairman stepped forward. The executives followed him back toward the center of the ballroom. Their faces were serious. The murmurs among the guests faded. We've reviewed the materials, Brenner said. My father folded his arms. And the evidence indicates negotiations were conducted without required board disclosure. That's a technicality. It's a violation of the trust agreement. Whitman, the lawyer, stepped beside Brenner. Under Eleanor Carter's will, he said calmly. That violation triggers the contingency review process. My father's voice sharpened. You're seriously invoking that clause? Brenner nodded slowly. Yes. A ripple of reaction spread through the room. Olivia stood near the stage, her expression frozen. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances. Whitman continued. The contingency clause requires temporary suspension of executive authority over the disputed transaction. My father laughed once. You're suspending me. Only regarding this negotiation, Brenner said. Whitman turned slightly toward me. And the clause designates a trustee to oversee the review. The moment stretched. Even before he said my name, I could feel the weight of the room shifting again. Natalie Carter, Whitman said. Every conversation stopped. Even the air seemed to pause. As trustee under the Carter Trust, he continued, you are now responsible for overseeing the investigation into the proposed Geneva Agreement. I felt dozens of eyes lock onto me. Just an hour ago, I had been walking toward the door after being told I didn't belong. Now, the same people who had barely noticed me were watching as if I suddenly mattered. Olivia whispered something under her breath. My father's expression darkened. You can't be serious, he said. Whitman didn't raise his voice. This was Eleanor Carter's instruction. Brenner looked at me carefully. The board will continue reviewing the evidence, he said. But the trust requires the trustee's oversight moving forward. Marcus stepped slightly back, giving me space. The ballroom waited. For the first time all night, no one was speaking over anyone else. I felt strangely calm, maybe because the moment didn't feel like revenge. It felt like responsibility. What happens now? I asked. Whitman answered. The trustee determines whether the transaction remains suspended during the investigation. I thought about my grandmother's study, about the quiet way she used to talk about the company, about the pride in her voice when she described the research teams trying to save lives. Then I looked at the executives. The negotiations with Geneva are suspended, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Until the board completes a full review. Brenner nodded once. That is consistent with the trust provisions. My father stared at me. You just killed $1 billion deal. I paused it, I replied. Across the ballroom, whispers spread like wildfire. The balance of the room had changed. The balance of the family had changed. And for the first time in my life, the Carter name didn't feel like something that belonged only to someone else. For a moment after I spoke, no one in the ballroom seemed to know what to do. The words had left my mouth calmly enough, but the effect rippled through the room like a sudden shift in gravity. The negotiations with Geneva were suspended. That single sentence had just frozen a deal worth billions of dollars. Harold Brenner was the first to move. He stepped forward and extended his hand toward me. Thank you, he said quietly. I stared at his hand for a second before shaking it. The gesture felt strange. All my life I had watched people greet my father this way. Now one of the most powerful executives in Carter Biotech was thanking me. Several other board members approached next. They weren't smiling, but their expressions held something new. Respect. We'll continue reviewing the documentation, one of them said. Your grandmother built strong safeguards into the trust. And tonight they worked exactly the way she intended. Another added. Across the room my father stood alone. Guests who had been surrounding him earlier had stepped away, leaving a noticeable space around him. I could feel his eyes on me. He wasn't shouting anymore. He was simply watching. Olivia finally moved toward us. Her wedding dress shimmered under the chandelier lights as she crossed the ballroom floor. For the first time all evening. She didn't look angry. She looked confused. What just happened? She asked. No one answered immediately. Marcus stepped beside me. The board activated a contingency clause your grandmother wrote into the Carter Trust, he said gently. Olivia shook her head. I know what a clause is, she said. She looked directly at me. I mean, why are you suddenly in charge of it? I hesitated. I'm not in charge of the company, I said. I'm overseeing the investigation. That sounds like the same thing, she replied. The frustration in her voice wasn't cruel. It sounded more like disbelief. For my entire life, she said quietly. Dad told me I would be running Carter Biotech someday. Her eyes searched my face. And tonight everyone suddenly decided it's you. That's not what happened, I said. Then explain it. I exhaled slowly. I didn't plan this. I know you didn't, she said. Her gaze moved briefly toward Marcus. But clearly someone did. Marcus shook his head. No one planned the situation, he said. We just uncovered it. Olivia crossed her arms. So why did you stop Natalie from leaving earlier? Marcus looked at me before answering. Because she's the trustee named in Eleanor Carter's clause. And if the trustee isn't present when the clause is triggered, the legal process becomes complicated. Olivia blinked. You're telling me you stopped my wedding to make sure Natalie was standing in the room. Marcus gave a small shrug. I stopped someone from being removed from the room where the truth needed to be heard. Olivia didn't respond. She looked down at the floor for a moment. Then she laughed softly. Grandma always did like dramatic timing. I wasn't sure whether to smile. A few feet away, my father finally walked toward us. The guests nearby instinctively stepped back. For a moment, none of us spoke. Thomas Carter looked at Olivia first. I'm sorry your wedding turned into this, he said. Olivia let out a tired sigh. It was going to be memorable either way. Then he turned to me. His voice had lost its sharp edge. Do you understand what you're doing now? I think so, I said. You're stepping into a world you never wanted. That part might be true. He studied me carefully. You think this is about protecting your grandmother's legacy? Isn't it? It's about controlling the future of a company. I shook my head. I'm not controlling anything. You froze $1 billion negotiation. I froze it until the board reviews it. For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. You sound like your grandmother. I wasn't sure whether that was meant as a compliment. Across the ballroom, the board members had begun discussing the documents again. Marcus leaned closer to me. There's one thing I should probably tell you, he said quietly. I glanced at him. What? I met your grandmother once. That surprised me. About a year ago, he said. We were discussing potential research partnerships. I waited. She asked a lot of questions about Carter Biotech's future, he continued. That doesn't surprise me. But before I left, she said something interesting. What? Marcus smiled faintly. She said the future of the company might depend on someone who didn't even realize they were part of the story yet. I blinked. She meant you, he said. I looked across the ballroom. My father stood near the far wall now, speaking quietly with one of the board members. Olivia had returned to the stage area, where her wedding planner was trying to salvage what remained of the ceremony schedule. Everything looked different than it had an hour earlier. Not just the room, the relationships inside it. For years I had been the invisible daughter, the one people politely ignored at family events. Now the entire balance of the Carter family had shifted in a single night. Marcus followed my gaze. "Your grandmother knew this moment would come," he said. I nodded slowly. For the first time, I believed he might be right, because tonight didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something my grandmother had prepared long before any of us realized it. The ballroom never fully recovered from what had happened. Even after the board members stepped aside to continue their discussions, and the hotel staff cautiously began clearing the shattered glass from the floor, the energy in the room had changed. A wedding was supposed to be predictable. Ceremony. Toasts. Dancing. Instead, my sister's reception had turned into the moment the entire Carter family balance shifted. People were still whispering everywhere. Not subtle whispers either. Open curiosity. Some guests were watching the board members. Others were watching my father. And quite a few were watching me. It was a strange feeling. For most of my life, I had been the easiest person in the room to overlook. Now it felt like everyone was trying to figure out who I actually was. Harold Brenner approached me again, this time with 2 other executives from the Carter Biotech board. "We'll begin the internal review first thing tomorrow morning," he said. His voice was steady. "Professional. This situation will require careful handling." "I understand," I replied. He studied me for a moment. "Your grandmother always believed the company needed someone willing to defend its mission. I'm not sure I'm that person," I admitted. Brenner gave a faint smile. "Tonight suggests otherwise." The other board member nodded. Eleanor Carter built the company to serve patients and research, not just shareholders. That principle matters more than ever now. I nodded slowly. Hearing them talk about my grandmother like that brought a quiet warmth to my chest. For years I had assumed I disappointed her. Apparently, I had misunderstood her completely. After the board members walked away, the room felt quieter. Marcus stepped beside me. "Well," he said softly. That escalated quickly. I let out a small laugh. "You think?" He glanced around the ballroom. "Your sister's wedding might be the most unusual board meeting I've ever attended. That makes 2 of us." For a moment we just stood there watching the guests. Some had started leaving quietly. Others were still lingering, clearly hoping to witness the rest of the drama. I noticed Olivia speaking with the wedding planner near the stage. Her dress looked as perfect as it had earlier, but her shoulders looked tired. When she finally walked toward me again, she didn't look angry anymore. Just thoughtful. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Probably," I said. "This night has already lasted longer than I expected." She nodded slowly. "I think the ceremony might continue eventually," she said. "But it definitely won't look the way I imagined." "I'm sorry about that." Olivia shook her head. "You didn't ruin my wedding." Her gaze moved briefly toward our father across the room. "That started long before tonight. For the first time all evening, we shared a quiet moment without tension between us. I really didn't know about the clause," I said. "I believe you." She hesitated. "You know, Dad is furious." I noticed. "But you were right about one thing," she added. "What?" "You didn't chase power." I waited. "You just didn't walk away from it." Her words surprised me. Then she gave a small shrug. Grandma would probably be proud. Hearing that meant more than I expected. Across the ballroom, my father stood near the bar speaking quietly with 2 executives. When he noticed me looking, our eyes met. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he nodded once. It wasn't approval. But it wasn't rejection either. For us, that was progress. Marcus cleared his throat gently. "So," he said, "what happens next?" "Tomorrow the board starts reviewing everything. And I help make sure the process follows the trust." Marcus smiled. "Your grandmother chose well." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked slowly toward the ballroom doors. The same doors I had tried to leave through earlier that night. Earlier, I had been walking out because I had been told I didn't belong. Now I was leaving for a completely different reason. I had nothing left to prove. As I reached the doors, One of the board members stopped me. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "thank you again for protecting the company tonight." I nodded. "I'm protecting my grandmother's work." Outside the ballroom, the hallway was quiet. The noise of the reception faded behind me. I paused for a moment and looked back through the glass doors. Inside, people were still talking, still reacting, still trying to understand what had happened. But I finally understood something myself. For years, I thought silence meant weakness. I thought being the quiet daughter meant I had no place in the family's story. Tonight proved something different. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one who ends up holding the truth no one else wants to face. And sometimes the moment someone tells you that you don't belong is the exact moment your life changes. So now I'm curious, have you ever been the person in your family that everyone underestimated? The quiet one, the invisible one, the one people assumed would never matter in the big decisions. If you have, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it in the comments. Stories like this remind us that sometimes strength doesn't look loud or powerful at first. Sometimes it just looks like someone refusing to walk away. And if you enjoy stories about family drama, hidden truths, and those rare moments when the tables finally turn, make sure you stay with this channel. Subscribe, and join me for the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful endings are only the beginning of something much bigger.